Yeah, we're starting with what I think is one of the most interesting parts of today. We'll be talking about healthcare, right? Health tech and healthcare. We'll be starting with a keynote now, followed by an expert panel that will discuss these topics further. We're starting now. We'd love you to pull them in. Yes, that would be great. But yeah, we'll be beginning now with a keynote from Markus Wanko. He is the managing partner at Exista Science Ventures, where they take scientific research findings and turn them into innovative ventures, real, tangible products and services. He's going to be setting the scene for the health tech conversation by discussing health tech trends and where investment is really most needed in the healthcare sector, as well as important considerations for investors, and ultimately giving you an idea of how to navigate this, the healthcare world, a very dynamic industry, and how to, make the most of it. So, without further ado, please give Markus a warm welcome onto the stage. Thank you. Pleasure.
An introduction. Well, thanks for the kind intro. Thanks to all of you for hanging out in here, actually. It's perfect that I'm not talking to an empty room. The question I was given is investing in the future of health worth the risk? And I guess you all know the pattern and have experienced that yourself, that if you want a specific answer to come out, you pick the person to ask the question to, right? So by asking someone who is actually investing in health, the answer obviously got to be a resounding yes. Everything else would be a bit funny. But I hope very much that the panel and me can give you a perspective on why we believe that and really fundamentally believe that. So let's get started. So this I did last week actually, and the automatic color coding that came out by Y Finance, reflected my mood at the time, because it shows sort of a steady upwards trending red, and some implosion in the blue, at some point, and a super slim margin victory for blue. But then obviously this is history, as we've all experienced. No, and in reality, this is S&P Biotech Index versus S&P 500 General Market Index. And what you obviously see is that if you discard for the COVID bubble in between, which obviously distorted the entire development of the industry, they're pretty coming out even, right? From a longer sort of 15-year perspective. So I think the answer is valid to say, well, if you don't really, at least in the public markets, outperform the market, is it worth higher risk, higher volatility? But it's very much, I think, in the eye of the beholder. If you look into the future, because that's obviously historic data, I think it is much more relevant actually to look at fundamentals, right? And look at what is actually really happening in the sector. And actually, let me use these couple of minutes that we have to broaden the aperture a little bit. And broadening the aperture means to look at where are the broad technological and scientific breakthroughs coming from? And against that sort of long-term perspective, it is really clear that we are living in an age of biology. That's absolutely the case if you look at sort of the historical, really big breakthroughs, right? Electricity, quantum physics, microelectronics, transistors, and all the fundamental revolutions that they have triggered 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. The most current paradigm that we are in, and this is despite AI, despite sort of many of the trends that are happening now in science, is biology. The biggest breakthroughs, and really sort of going beyond scratching the surface of understanding how cells or molecular biology really works, happened in the 60s and 70s, right? Human Genome Project, the first time really decoding human genomes, was completed in 2003. That was just a mere 20 years ago. And that's, I think, the general setting that we should apply when we look at long-term trends. Where are we today? Different ways to look at this, but one way to look at it is to see how much of potentially druggable proteins are we actually targeting today. And if you start that, I talked about the Human Genome Project, which came out with sort of everybody of us has 20, 25,000 genes. in all of their cells, which is interesting because we went into this exercise thinking it would be 100,000, but that's just a little side note. So out of those, we are looking at functionally distinct proteins, so targets for potential drugs, in the range of 80 to 100,000. Any guess how many of these proteins we are currently targeting with everything that's out in the market? It's somewhere in this range, right? 700 to 800. And obviously not all of them, and by far not all of them, are reachable. And with conventional methods, the estimates are we can reach something between 3,000 to 4,000, roughly, right? We are right now really in a phase where a lot of new technologies, new modalities on how to reach exactly these proteins are being discovered, not only discovered, but really implemented in the market. And the estimates are that sort of with these new modalities, we can target up to 10,000 proteins, roughly. It's obviously not a fixed number, but contrast the 700 to 800 proteins we're currently targeting with the 10,000 potential. And beyond individual targets, I think the advantage that all of you have seen in our systemic understanding of the immune system, for instance, that led to this entire revolution in immune oncology that you've probably seen. Protein degradation system, where a lot of research is actually happening here in Vienna that has given rise to entirely new target classes. So I could go on and on, but there is really a lot of new science happening. If you look at these new modalities, which are not just in the lab, but which are already on the market, with a very significant number in the global pipeline, then we don't have to go through all the individual parts of that, but both on the modality side and on the technology side, a lot of exciting new stuff is happening. If you look at imaging, for instance, cryo-EMs historically really developing new levels of light imaging, gene editing, CRISPR-Cas obviously is known to everybody, synthetic biology, the possibilities to synthesize new genes. So I could go on and on. There's really a lot of happening right now. The last item on the slide before was connectomics, so really understanding how the brain is wired. Brain clearly sort of the holy grail in the biological research activities right now. I didn't do anything. So this is. Any guess what that is? So this is a wiring diagram of a fruit fly, of the brain of a fruit fly. And we are talking about a scale of a few thousand neurons that actually make up this wiring diagram. It has been a major breakthrough that has just been published a month ago. The human brain we are talking about 90 billion neurons, right? So this is a real many orders of magnitudes difference, and this is all to come. I'm not going to talk more about this because that could go on forever, but I just want to instill on you where we are scientifically and technologically in that field and how much there is still to come. But that obviously is Invest Austria, so we are going to talk about money. So let me shift gears, right? So total markets, huge, right? Total healthcare market, US, $4.5 trillion annually, EU 27, 2 trillion. I actually plotted the percentage by GDP because the sort of most stark difference is in the relative spending that the US, with a really, in many aspects, non-functioning healthcare market, is spending there, right, with almost 17% of GDP. And if you look at this more closely, so that's the total health spending, this $4.5 trillion per year in the US, what you realize is that less than 10% actually goes into biopharma and drugs, right? 70% goes to providers, so this is hospitals, this is clinics, this is physicians, and when we sort of move on to talk about these different subsegments within healthcare, biopharma, medtech, health tech in whatever definition you want to be using for that, then obviously the base that you're addressing with this, right? With devices that allow preventive medicine, care, delivery technologies, the system improvements, the base is much bigger, right? The base is much bigger. If you look at admin spending, for instance, US spends about 1% of total healthcare spending on IT, which is, orders of magnitude improvable. And on the contrary, you see the admin costs there. So the base is much bigger, but it is interesting then to see that if you look at total investment by venture capital funds, and these are actually deal book numbers, so they also, I think, to be taken with some grain of salt. But the biggest category within the health spectrum is still biotech and pharma, with sort of a total of 34 billion spent last year, 25 health tech. But obviously interesting, if you add it up combined, this is the largest investment vertical across all the different industries, right? So from a European perspective now, if we look at these different verticals, where do we see sort of a competitive and advantage against the US generally? And I think there are different lenses obviously to apply there, and we'll be discussing this on the panel as well. But I think these differences structurally that you have seen have the following impact. Sort of the non-pharma healthcare market is much larger in the US, right? So everything that's addressing non-pharma will find immediately an easier accessible market as well. If you look at the improvement potential, then sort of different estimates about wasteful spending are significantly higher in the US. That shows here the admin spending in the different countries, 8% of total healthcare costs spent on admin in the US versus an OECD average of 3%. So that's obviously huge savings potential. Also, when you start sort of addressing something where the healthcare systems are relevant, then the fragmentation in the European market is not particularly helpful as an initial entry. Whereas if you look at the biopharma segment, the situation, I think, is quite different, and it starts with the stage and the state of the industry. That's the top 5 pharma companies in the US and Europe by market cap current. And that's a chart that you can't draw for many industries, right? So what you'll see is that the top 5 companies on both continents are roughly similarly sized, right? That's one of the key advantages, I think, that we in Europe still have, and something that is obviously relevant when we look at biopharma. On science, I think it's pretty clear, and this has been often said, we are on par with the US, I think by many measures, right? And we don't have to go into much more detail there, but if you compare individual institutions, Max Planck and Harvard, it's really the same output, right? It is the same scientific output. It's when it moves into sort of more commercial output, it's probably less than that, but that's something that has been discussed many times as well. And most importantly, I think, if you look at biopharma and medtech compared to sort of some of the more system relevant projects, is IP, right? In biopharma, you have an established process, and also in medtech, of IP protection globally. And in the end, it doesn't even matter that much where you're originally coming from or from which scientific institution the original idea is coming from. So this, from our perspective, is a strong reason why we think within the broader healthcare spectrum, biopharma is generally interesting, is interesting from a European perspective, and particularly, that's not an Austrian event only, but because we're here in Vienna, from a Viennese perspective. I think what's really important is to see we got the science, we got great hospitals, and I hope that we, in the discussion that we have right now, I think we can really dive a little bit deeper on that. That's why we are doing what we are doing. We have, just one word about us, so we have invested in 13 life science, so both on the medtech and biopharma side, So far, this is all these new modalities that I talked about before. I don't necessarily need to go into the details, but that's immuno-oncology, this is ADCs, that's protein and proximity-based drugs. Really a pretty wide and I think interesting collection of science that has come out, mostly here of Vienna. And on that note, I thank you very much for hanging out, also the other ones for coming, and we'll have the panel on stage, I guess, right?
Applause for Marcus. Thank you.